There is a hill in the English countryside where, for one single day in the autumn of the year 1066, the future of the entire world hung on the discipline of exhausted men standing shoulder to shoulder in a wall of wood and iron. It is easy, from the comfort of the present, to forget that history is not decided by kings sitting on thrones. It is decided by the men who refuse to break. And on the ridge above the small Sussex town of Hastings, an army of English warriors would make one of the most formidable cavalry forces in Europe question everything they believed about how wars were won. To understand the terror that gripped the Norman ranks that day, one must first understand what they were riding into. Duke William of Normandy had crossed the Channel with a coalition of knights, mercenaries, and archers, confident in the superiority of mounted warfare, a tactic that had crushed kingdoms across the continent. Cavalry charges were supposed to shatter infantry lines. Horses were supposed to trample disorganized foot soldiers into the mud within minutes. This was the accepted logic of continental warfare, tested and proven on a dozen battlefields from Flanders to Sicily. But the men waiting for them on Senlac Hill under King Harold Godwinson had no intention of following the script. What the Normans found when they began their assault was not a scattered rabble to be run down. It was a wall. Housecarls, the elite professional soldiers of the English crown, stood locked together with their kite shields overlapping, axes and spears bristling from behind an unbroken barrier of wood and iron. Behind them stood the Fyrd, the free men of England called to arms, reinforcing every gap with grim, unyielding resolve. When the first Norman cavalry charge slammed into that wall, something happened that should not have happened according to every rule of medieval warfare. The wall held. Horses reared and refused to close the final yards, sensing what their riders could not yet accept, that a line of infantry was not going to simply dissolve at the sound of hooves. Norman knights, men trained since childhood to believe that a mounted charge was unstoppable, found their momentum breaking apart against a barrier of English shields that simply would not move. Imagine the psychological shock of that moment for a Norman soldier. You have crossed the sea. You have trained your entire life on the doctrine that heavy cavalry breaks any infantry formation. You lower your lance, you drive your spurs into your horse, and you charge directly into a wall of men who do not run, do not scatter, and do not die quickly enough to open a path. Instead, English axes, heavy enough to cleave through a horse's neck in a single blow, come down from above the shield line with brutal mechanical precision. Men who had never faced defeat on a European battlefield were now watching their comrades and their horses fall in front of an obstacle that refused every law of momentum they had ever trusted. Panic began to spread through sections of William's own army. At one point, a rumor tore through the Norman ranks that the Duke himself had been killed. Order began to fracture. Soldiers who had crossed an entire sea for what they believed would be a swift, decisive victory were now facing the very real possibility of being routed on a foreign shore with no line of retreat but the Channel behind them. William was forced to physically remove his helmet and ride along his own collapsing lines just to prove to his men that he was still alive, that the invasion had not already failed within its opening hours. For the length of an entire day, an army built entirely around the assumption of cavalry. Supremacy was humbled by the sheer immovable discipline of English infantry. Charge after charge broke against that hill. The English shield wall did not simply survive the Norman assault. It inflicted a level of doubt on some of the most feared knights in Europe that no chronicler on the continent had ever needed to record before. This was not supposed to be possible. Professional continental cavalry was not supposed to fail against foot soldiers standing in the open. And yet here, on English soil, it very nearly did. It was not raw force that eventually turned the tide, but a tactic drawn from desperation, and one that speaks to the sophistication of Norman commanders who realized brute strength alone would never break this wall. William's forces began staging feigned retreats, pulling back in apparent disorder to lure sections of the Fyrd down from the ridge in pursuit, breaking the very cohesion that had made the wall unbreakable in the first place. Each time a portion of the English line pursued what looked like a retreating enemy, Norman cavalry wheeled back and cut them down in the open field, away from the protection of their shields and their brothers in arms. It was a tactic built entirely around the terrifying reality that the wall itself could not be beaten head-on. The only way through English resolve was to trick it into breaking its own formation. As the day wore on into the fading autumn light, Norman archers began adjusting the arc of their volleys, raining arrows down at a steeper angle to fall behind the shield line rather than into it. It was in this final phase of the battle that King Harold himself was struck down, and with the fall of their king, the discipline that had held for hours finally began to give way. Even so, pockets of English warriors continued fighting even after the royal standard fell, refusing to abandon the ground they had defended since the first light of morning. Norman chroniclers themselves, men writing in the service of the victors, could not help but record their astonishment at how close the entire invasion had come to catastrophic failure against a wall of shields that had almost done what no continental infantry had managed to do before. The Battle of Hastings did not end with an easy Norman stroll to victory. It ended with an army that had crossed the sea supremely confident in the superiority of cavalry, forced to invent new tactics on the spot, forced to spread false rumors of their own duke's death just to hold their nerve, and forced to lure Englishmen into open ground because they could not break them standing still. What began that October morning as a demonstration of the terrifying resilience of English fighting men would go on to reshape the course of the entire island's history, but it was the shield wall on Senlac Hill, standing against the finest cavalry in Europe, that first proved a truth England would repeat again and again across the centuries that followed. Its enemies could bring numbers, its enemies could bring new technology and new tactics. But breaking English resolve outright, on open ground, shield to shield, would never be as easy as any invader assumed before the first charge began.